All right, man, peace. First off, shouts out to my brother Chris. He's a big Pittsburgh Steelers fan. So it hurts my heart to have to go in like this on his team, on his franchise. But I did a video about a month and a half ago pertaining to Mr. Antonio Brown, the superstar wide receiver of the Pittsburgh Steelers. And I stated in the video that he was an agent of chaos and that eventually he would do something that would lead to his and or his team's demise. And when I call somebody an agent of chaos, basically all I'm saying is that they cannot control their narcissism. There are various levels of narcissism. And if you're going to believe in yourself to accomplish any endeavor, there does have to be a component of narcissism within you. But when you cannot control it, that is when you become an agent of chaos. So when I use that term agent of chaos, basically I'm referring to any individual or demographic who cannot control themselves. They cannot confine their sense of self-worship and self-importance. So that's why I call Antonio Brown an agent of chaos. That's why I call LeBron James an agent of chaos. Odell Beckham, the woman, period. Because they're uncontrolled narcissists. They think that everything has to revolve around them. And if they see energy leaning towards someone else in any way, shape, or form, they're going to act out. They're going to throw a tantrum. They're going to have a conniption, have a fit to make sure that everything comes back around to them. And like I tell you brothers over and over again in these videos, I can see it coming. I can see it coming. That's why I did 2 videos on Antonio Brown about a month and a half ago that I released, where I basically was trying to highlight to you brothers what was very obvious to me. That being that he was very jealous of Mr. Juju Smith-Schuster, the up-and-coming great wide receiver of the Pittsburgh Steelers. And even though their numbers are basically the same, he still saw Juju Smith-Schuster as a possible replacement for him. He felt threatened by Juju, despite the fact that he would make commercials with Juju Smith-Schuster in them, and they would have their little silly touchdown dances in the end zone together. I could tell. And Antonio Brown, he does have a certain level of reason to feel insecure about Juju Smith-Schuster, because if you followed the Pittsburgh Steelers over the last 25 years, one thing that the Steelers do very well is draft wide receivers. They can find wide receivers, man. Whether it's Hines Ward, Plaxico Burress, Mike Wallace, Antonio Brown, the list goes on and on and on and on. Emmanuel Sanders, so on and so forth. They can find a great wideout. Martavius Bryant. So I believe that Antonio Brown believes that they're trying to build up Juju Smith-Schuster to replace him as the alpha, even though he's already getting his money. Antonio Brown is so proud of where he stands in the NFL hierarchy of receivers that he's worried that his replacement is going to ease him aside. And this is not anything new. When Jerry Rice was the #1 wide receiver in the NFL back in the early to mid 90s, he suffered a very, very bad knee injury. Warren Sapp grabbed him on a reverse. The 49ers were trying to run a reverse play. And Warren Sapp, the great defensive tackle of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, got into the backfield, grabbed Jerry Rice, basically twisted him into a pretzel, and he tore up his knee. He came back the next year, of course, but by then the 49ers had drafted J.J. Stokes and Terrell Owens. At least I believe they did, right after he got hurt. And we all know that Terrell Owens went on to become one of the top 5 wide receivers of all time. But while Jerry and J.J. Stokes and Terrell Owens were there was an atmosphere of insecurity and discomfort because Jerry Rice wanted his spot back, even though he was 35 years old. He saw what Terrell Owens and J.J. Stokes represented. Even though neither one of them were as good as him, Terrell Owens was more physically gifted than Jerry, but he did not have the maturity of Jerry because Jerry came from a patriarchal home. Terrell Owens came from a matriarchal home. So that's why it was so common for Terrell Owens to have those mental breakdowns. Either way, there was a level of discomfort that was not really alleviated until Jerry Rice was moved and he left the 49ers and had a renaissance with the Oakland Raiders. The 49ers and Steve Mariucci, before Jerry Rice left, basically let him know that his services would no longer be needed. When on Jerry Rice Day, they targeted Terrell Owens like 21 times. He caught something like 18 or 20 passes. Jerry Rice only caught like 7 passes on Jerry Rice Day. So that let him know that he would never, ever, ever be considered the alpha on the 49ers ever again. These are things that go through the minds of wide receivers because they play a very dependent position. And that is what is going on in the mind of Antonio Brown, who is a big narcissist and an agent of chaos. So we'll see. And you know what? At the end of the day, this will probably work out better for Antonio than had he not said anything. Because it's very clear that Big Ben Roethlisberger does not like him, and he does not like Big Ben. But they need one another. Big Ben is playing the game very well. He's trying to act as if he has no idea why AB is upset with him, but he's been conducting himself in a very passive, aggressive manner towards AB for the entire season. There have been occasions where Big Ben came out point blank and said we should have targeted Juju Smith-Schuster all 4 times. I believe it was against the Denver Broncos. Very recently, the team gave Juju Smith-Schuster the MVP of the team. They had to know how that would make Antonio Brown feel because at the end of the day, he is a very sensitive soul. So it's very clear that the Pittsburgh Steelers have huge culture problems in their locker room. And another personage associated with their team that I made videos about is Mr. Mike Tomlin. And for a few years now, I've been trying to figure out who the hell does Mike Tomlin remind me of? And I finally figured it out. I caught Remember the Titans on TV the other day with Denzel Washington. And I said, that's it. That's who this nigga Mike Tomlin tries to be. He tries to be Coach Boone. Ain't this a bitch? That's who it is. Mike Tomlin tries to be Coach Boone. I'm a winner. I'm going to win. I said, I finally figured out who this nigga tries to model himself after. But anyway, they're going to talk about it. I'm going to chime in.
But let's start with what's dominating headlines. It's Pittsburgh. It's Steel City. All hell broke loose when it was reported that Brown was benched Sunday against the Bengals after he missed the team's meetings and workout on Saturday, and that he allegedly wasn't dealing with a knee injury. Here's Mike Tomlin on all this.
When he did not show up on Saturday and I didn't know the extent of his injury, I made the decision at that time, regardless of how he felt at any point, that we were moving on and getting singularly focused on preparing to play the game. When he woke up on Sunday and felt better and Drew reached out and expressed that, I expressed to Drew that playing was not on the table because we had to draw a line in the dirt in terms of getting our group ready to play and make the last minute preparations and so forth. Obviously, we take his lack of communication, his lack of presence, particularly on Saturday prior to the game, to be something that's very significant and will be handled appropriately so.
Thank you, Coach Boone. But here's the real problem. The real problem is that it's very obvious that Antonio Brown and Ben Roethlisberger have had communication issues. They've had relationship issues for a long time now, and you have not done anything about it. And that's your job. You do a very good job of giving great speeches to the media. That's what you're best at. But when it comes to handling things in the locker room, I think that you leave a lot to be desired. That's rather obvious. And that's part and parcel of being a manager of men. Even though you might be no nonsense, Mike Tomlin, when you have other components in your locker room on your team that are sensitive or who might be high maintenance, you have to have the psychological skills to deal with them. You have to be able to call them into your office and make sure that they're okay, to alleviate their concerns. And it's very clear that Mike Tomlin's answer to every problem is to act like he's Knute Rockne or General Patton. And that's not going to work with everybody.
I'm not going to speculate on trades and things of that nature.
Well, you don't have the ability to do so because you're not the GM. You better be speculating on the potentiality that you might get let go eventually, Mike Tomlin. Because, I mean, let's be very clear, and a lot of people are not going to like this. He won his Super Bowl with Bill Cowher's leftovers. He got back in 2010, I believe it was, with the vestiges of what Bill Cowher built up. And I'm not trying to come down too hard on the brother. He's done a good job with what has been left and what he's been able to build up in the aftermath of the departure of great players like Troy Polamalu, etc. But I just find it to be very strange that so many prominent Steeler players like Le'Veon Bell and James Harrison and now Antonio Brown are very unhappy with his management skills.
We haven't formally received a request in that regard, so I'm not going to speculate. I'm not going to speculate in terms of where the discipline might go and things of that nature. Just know that it's going to be addressed and it will be addressed and needs to be addressed for obvious reasons.
And guys, check this out. 2 minutes after Tomlin had said that, Brown tweeted, "My options may seem limited by people or circumstances. It is then that I remind myself I am in command of my attitude. I am divinely blessed with free..."
Now look at this photo on the left-hand side. This dude is smiling. The light is shining down on his face. In other words, he's worshiping himself as usual. A lot of these athletes, they act like they're talking to God. They're talking to themselves. They're not talking to God. Most of these athletes that talk about God so much, they're really talking about themselves.
With free will, I utilize that gift, choosing to take charge of my life to express the creativity, vitality, and wholeness that truly define me. So, Stephen, I ask you this. Should the Steelers trade him?
Should the Steelers trade Antonio Brown?
Yes.
Let me say this very quickly before Stephen A. Smith answers, because remember, he's a Steeler fan. So I can't trust him to make an objective observation. Yes, they should move Antonio Brown. You're not winning with him. So what difference does it make? And your track record shows that you can draft great wide receivers and you can develop them. So move him now and draft somebody to replace him.
Hell no. Listen, let me tell y'all something.
See, Stephen A. Smith is that guy who tries to hold on to the chick with the fat ass and the big titties. Even though she has a nasty attitude, she's verbally abusive, he still wants to hang on to her because he's scared he can't replace her. The Steelers have already replaced him, and he knows that. That's why he's so upset. Juju had more catches and more yards already this year. So move on from him. Make Juju number 1, move Washington over to number 2, and draft another young wide receiver. That's it.
It's the new year. We're going to try to be nice. I'm a very good boy to have a nice vacation. I'm going to try to be nice. But, you know, this kind of stuff really irritates me. I mean, who are we talking about here? We talking about some role play. We talking about some average dude. We're talking about
Stephen A. Smith, I have news for you. Even though he's a great wide receiver, his attitude and the lack of dependability that he constantly exhibits makes him an average dude. It makes him average. And I'm on record as saying, as a pass catcher, other than Jay Rice, he's the best that I've seen. He's not the most exciting. He's not the most unbelievable. That, of course, is Randy Moss. But when it comes to pass catching, running the route tree, coming up big in big games, Jay Rice and Antonio Brown is right there behind him. Also, Steve Smith. When it comes to running the route tree, coming up big in big games, so on and so forth, right there. Michael Irvin, so on and so forth. But when it comes to his persona, his personality, it makes him expendable.
About Antonio Brown, a guy that is universally recognized as one of the top 2 or 3 receivers in all of football.
So compare him to Julio Jones, and we'll have our answer. Julio Jones basically is untradeable. Dude is 6'3", runs a 4.3 40, has a 40-inch vertical, great hands, and you never hear a peep out of him. Look at DeAndre Hopkins, another great receiver that nobody talks about because he operates outside of the nonsense. We're always hearing about Antonio Brown and Odell Beckham. Why is that? And look at their teams. Their teams are known for losing games that they should have won.
Not just 1 year, not this last season, not 2 years, the last 6 years. He has had a minimum of 101 receptions. He has had a minimum of 1,284 yards. He led the league in touchdowns this year with 15 from the receiver's position. The dude is a flat-out stud. And, oh, by the way, over that time period, he had only missed 3 games in the last 6 years before missing last weekend's game. Does that absolve him from ridicule? No. Does it absolve him from guilt? No. Does it make you say, you know what, he does, just leave him alone, he doesn't deserve to be bothered? Of course not. You have to be responsible. When you're elite with greatness comes great responsibility. I get all of that. But at the end of the day, you keep this brother. Because guess what? You don't go out on the field with a good personality and no game and excel.
Right, but here's the problem. They're not excelling anyway. They're not winning big games anyway, Stephen A. Smith. Even with him. So why not trade him now while you still can? He's 30 years old. You can get something for him right now. Move him right now while you can and draft a great receiver.
You go out on the field. You don't go out on the field with good professionalism but no skills and excel. You got to be great. And this brother is one of the greatest in the game today. It does not absolve him from any stretch of the imagination, and I got my own stuff with him, which I'll get into later. But I will tell you that overall, when you talk about trading this man, that is asinine. There is nothing to think about here because you don't find greatness like that every day. Players win football games, and Antonio Brown can ball.
No, sir, not quite. Players don't win football games. Execution wins football games. You can be as athletic as you want. You can be as great as you want. There are many great players who are sitting at home. Look at Aaron Rodgers. Aaron Rodgers did not even make the playoffs. Why is that? Because his team and himself did not execute in crucial moments. And part of the reason why players don't execute is because of a bad atmosphere in the locker room, bad culture. And if Antonio Brown is a part of that culture, he has to go.
Max, what do you think?
1,499 yards, 8 touchdowns. 1,698 yards, 13 touchdowns. 1,834 yards, 10 touchdowns. Almost 1,300 yards, 12 touchdowns. Led the league 1,533 yards, 9 touchdowns. Led the league with 15 touchdowns this year, 1,297 yards. You trade him. You trade Antonio Brown.
Agreed.
Brown. Those numbers that I just recited place him among the best who ever did it, and he's probably still in his prime. You know, going forward, you eyeball test says, yep, that's Antonio Brown, and it should be for the foreseeable future. And yet you trade him. Why do you trade him? Well, there are 3 reasons you trade him, Stephen A. Number 1, what has he done? He has become a problem in the locker room, clearly. That has been widely reported.
And he's been a problem for a while. He's been a problem for a while. And for a while, he's been able to escape a lot of the castigation that has befallen Mr. Odell Beckham. And it has made people think that Odell Beckham was worse than him. And I've been saying for a while now that no, there are 2 peas in the same pod. And it was only a matter of time before it was revealed.
That it's obvious to any observer. By the way, let's even just take it back to, what was it, not this past year, the season previous, where Mike Tomlin is giving a speech in the locker room about staying off social media, and this dude is posting to Facebook Live.
Yes, he's not the sharpest knife in the drawer.
That's why we know Tomlin was giving the speech, because you could hear it in the background. And has it gotten better or worse since then? It certainly does not appear to have gotten better. Now, Antonio Brown is right to say whatever he said. Go ahead, express yourself if you want. You also have to live with the consequences of
Agreed.
Of that. He is one of the best who ever did it, but that means, so 1, he's a problem in the locker room. 2, you can get enormous draft capital for him. Antonio Brown's going to fetch you at least a first-round pick. Here's another reason, Stephen A. You clear enormous cap room. Here's another reason, Stephen A.
Well, I do believe that even if they move Antonio Brown, it's not going to affect their cap. If I'm wrong about that, one of you brothers can correct me.
If Antonio Brown was the only number 1 receiver on the team, I understand it. You know, this is maybe the best receiving combinations or tandem since, Moss and Carter, or at least they have a chance to be. But that's the point. You have Juju Smith-Schuster. He is also one of the best receivers in football.
Absolutely. Look at the numbers. All his numbers are better than AB's except for touchdowns. Now, it does have to be taken into account that as a number 2, he's not seeing the same type of coverage that AB is seeing. So his numbers may suffer next year once the secondary rolls over to his side. But as of right now, he's definitely the best number 2 in the NFL, which would make you think that he's capable of being a number 1 as long as they can replace his number 2 with somebody like a James Washington, who you would hope would grow into that position, into that role, and also drafting another receiver.
Juju Smith-Schuster is an absolute top-shelf, elite number 1 receiver. If he's your number 1 receiver, you're not looking for a guy. So, in the NFL, a league with a hard cap, yes, having extra is good, but you don't need to be redundant at a position like that. And by position, I just don't mean receiver. I mean top number 1 receiver, especially if he's very expensive, which Antonio Brown is. So you have a very expensive receiver, where you have another number 1 receiver. He's the problem in the locker room, and you can get a hellified draft pick compensation for him. Plus, that's why you trade Antonio Brown.
Agreed.
Well, I'm going to tell you why. I don't want to hear that, and here's one of the reasons why. We didn't say that when the Oakland Raiders decided to let go of Khalil Mack, who was a dominant defensive player in the National Football League.
Right, but there were no notions that Khalil Mack was a problem in the locker room. So that's a totally different situation.
Last time I checked, in the 5 years or so that he was in Oakland, they only made the playoffs once. The reality is that you still lamented the fact, we all still lamented the fact that he was gone because you don't find those players every day. I understand what you're saying in terms of potentially a high draft pick, cap space, or whatever. But why are you doing all of that? To acquire players the magnitude of Antonio Brown, if you're lucky.
Yes, players of the magnitude of Antonio Brown, who you would hope would abide by the rules stipulated by the organization that they play for.
And also, one of the things that I want to get into is this, Max. I am so, and it's not really about you. It's just a personal preference that I have when we're talking about coaches and beyond. I mean, Max, if everything's got to be all right, and it's got to be peace, and everybody's got to hug and sing kumbaya with one another, why the hell do I need you as a coach? Why do I need the GM? What do I need you for? Everybody can't have the...
In other words, Stephen A. Smith, what are you really saying? You better be careful where you lean your argument. Because if you're saying that if everything needs to be PC and everything needs to be copacetic, therefore you don't need the coach, what you're really saying is that Mike Tomlin is not managing his people properly. So you're moving the bullseye from Antonio Brown over to Mike Tomlin. I don't disagree with that, but just be very careful because we all know you're a Mike Tomlin fanboy.
The ideal personality, man. Everybody can't have that.
I hear you, but they just missed the playoffs. And
okay,
they missed the playoffs,
and that was on him?
Well, no, but was there...
Well, who was it on then, Stephen A. Smith? Because we know you don't want to blame Antonio Brown. You don't want to blame Mike Tomlin. Big Ben, you might try to give him some blame, but he threw for over 5,000 yards. So somebody has to get blamed somewhere.
Is there a team chemistry issue this year? Like you see that in Baltimore, who made the playoffs? So if there's a team chemistry issue, look, let's put it this way. Let's say J.J. Watt was a problem in the locker room, right? Mm-hmm. You have Jadeveon Clowney. If J.J. Watt was a problem in the locker room, he's the opposite, but let's say he was. You could get a first-round pick and maybe then some for him, and you have another guy who does what he does. It's different. Khalil Mack, there's no other Khalil Mack on the team.
And beyond that, once again, Khalil Mack was not a problem in the locker room. That's why that was so controversial. And even that, I did not have a huge problem with because Gruden knew what he came in there for. He came in there to scrap everything clean, scrape it clean, move all the players who he felt like he could not build around or build up with, who he was unsure wanted to be there in his view. And if you're going to be bad, be all the way bad. Don't be 6-10, be 2-14 or 3-13. So you can get higher draft picks. Why go 7-9 when you can go 2-14 and get a higher draft pick? That was the point of all that. When it comes to AB and the Pittsburgh Steelers, they have far higher expectations than even the Raiders do. The Raiders have not competed for a world championship since the early 2000s when Jerry Rice and Tim Brown were there, Rich Gannon and those guys.
Let me tell you this. First of all, I don't want to hear that from you, Max Kellerman, because you got to make up your mind. A week ago, it was about Le'Veon Bell. You sacrificed the season because of Le'Veon Bell. That's what you said. I sat up there. I was the one who said, excuse me, that's relevant if we're talking about a Super Bowl title. We're talking about making the playoffs. And you said, bottom line is they sabotaged this season with Le'Veon Bell. You pointed out how big Ben Roethlisberger.
Right, but I have to ask the question about Le'Veon Bell. And we all know that Le'Veon Bell has not made the best decisions off the football field, but is he known for being a player who got into fights with teammates or, in practice or what have you? Was that what he was doing? I believe the only time that he missed practice was when he was holding out. If I'm wrong about that, one of you brothers can correct me. I just think that Stephen A. is trying to compare apples to oranges because he does not want to lose a high-profile player like Antonio Brown, and that's very dangerous.
Was throwing those red zone interceptions. You pointed out how big Ben Roethlisberger was.
Brothers, let me say this very quickly, and this is why I like to use sports as a backdrop for certain conversations. Once you show someone who is overly destructive, especially to themselves, that you're scared to let them go, that they're not going to be considered expendable, what you're doing is you're tacitly confirming to them that not only do they have permission to continue to be self-destructive, but they now have permission to carry over that destructive nature into your life. All right. So when you deal with a woman and that woman is self-destructive, she's self-hateful, that energy is going to trickle over to you. And when you're not strong enough to let her go, it's going to be your fault. Stephen A. Smith is showing a lot of weakness here towards Antonio Brown. And what he's doing is he's enabling the bad decision-making of Mike Tomlin over the last 4 or 5 years.
Like Antonio Brown. So what I'm saying is, this season the Steelers not making the playoffs. That's not on Antonio Brown.
That's right. They should have re-signed Le'Veon Bell if they wanted to make the playoffs. They didn't. They didn't make the playoffs. You say you're hoping to find with that draft pick in Antonio Brown. You probably won't, but you'll find a good player who's really cheap, and you'll have money to go out and sign free agents.
The Pittsburgh Steelers once again have shown more than any other organization that they know how to draft and develop wide receivers. If they lost Antonio Brown, it will not cripple their franchise.
At this point, the time has come. They need to move on from Antonio Brown.
Please, I ain't letting go of Antonio Brown.
All right, well, we're not done talking about the Steelers. You know what's...
They just found Juju Smith-Schuster 2 years ago, Stephen A. Smith. Who would have thought that guy would have a over 100 catch season with over 1,400 yards? Like, he's going to the Pro Bowl.
Oh, it's funny to think that despite the Browns, their divisional rival, not having a head coach, they seem less dysfunctional than the Steelers right now.
That's interesting. That's a very true observation.
Maybe.
Not done talking Steelers. We have much more.
But anyway, that's basically it on that. We'll see how things go with Mr. Antonio Brown. But as I stated at the beginning of the video, he is an agent of chaos. I saw it from the very beginning because he's a narcissist. He's somebody who has to be everywhere. He just loves the glare of the spotlight shining on his forehead. That's why even in that caption that he put up on his social media, what did it show? It showed the light shining down on his face. He's all about him. And to a degree, most receivers are like that. But when it goes overboard, they have to go. But anyway, peace.